Hi all, and welcome to Chess News number 47. At the moment, the second Sinkfield Cup is being played in St. Louis, Missouri, and we're going to take a look at a game from the third round between world champion Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces against world number 2 Fabiano Caruana with black. So Carlsen opens the game with e4, and Fabiano answers classically with e5. Now the second move, we see bishop c4, and again, as little theory as possible for Magnus, which really seems to be his style these days. Knight f6, hitting the pawn on e4, which is protected with d3. And now, since white has not played too ambitiously, black is going to try and set up a broad pawn center on d5 and e5, and he prepares that with the move c6. Knight f3 is played, and here comes d5, attacking the bishop on c4. Now white does not really want to exchange on d5, because after e takes d5 and c takes d5, black would have two pawns in the center and white would only have one. And also the c6 square would be vacated for the b8 knight, which could develop itself very nicely to that square. So instead, Carlsen prefers to maintain the tension, and he simply retreats the bishop with bishop b3. Now black could try and make use of the fact that for the moment he's attacking the e4 pawn 2 times, and it's only protected once. So play could continue with d takes e4. And then knight takes e5 would really be a blunder, because black would have a double attack with queen a5 picking up that knight. But instead, after d takes e4, white is well advised to play knight g5, so keeping that 5th rank blocked. Now you may ask yourself, okay, but why not recapture the pawn? Let's have a look at that first. If we recapture the pawn, then play could continue like so. And then indeed, after knight takes e4, black has the better of it. He won a pawn. White no longer has the right to castle. So this would be a very good opening advantage for black. So that's why after d takes e4, white should play knight g5, counter-attacking on f7. And black's best then really is to give up his light squared bishop with bishop e6, which is a bit of a pity. And after knight takes e6, f takes e6, white has a very interesting option. He could, for instance, continue with the pawn sacrifice castles, when I think taking on d3 is really a little bit dangerous for black, because he's still way behind in development. White is very strong on the light squares, and he could develop an attack on that color complex. So after bishop b3, we don't see Caruana taking on e4. Instead, he plays bishop b4 check, looking to inconvenience Carlsen a little bit. And Carlsen now feels compelled to play c3, and this is one of the points of the check on b4, because black now drops back the bishop. But what has he achieved? Well, he has achieved that now the white knight from b1 can no longer develop itself to c3, from where it would really like to influence the center. There is a battle going on the light squares in the center, right, on d5 and on e4, and obviously white would like to play knight c3 to help influence that battle. But since his pawn has been lured to c3 by the bishop b4 check, that is no longer possible. However, there is another piece that white can bring into the battle of the light squares in the center, and that is the bishop from c1. So Carlsen now plays bishop g5, and he may already be threatening to win a pawn on d5, simply because he's pinning one of the defenders of that pawn on d5. Now it was perfectly logical and possible for black to maintain the tension with bishop e6, just bringing in another defender of the d5 square, when after the surprising d4, trying to attack the pawn on e5, black could simply play knight b d7 and have a good game. But instead of keeping the tension, he sort of now admits that he cannot keep his strong pawn center anymore, and Caruana now plays d takes e4. It's not a mistake or something, but, well, I guess you always prefer to keep both central pawns next to each other in the middle there. But now he sort of gives in and says to white, okay, so for the moment maybe you win this small central battle on the light squares, and I will exchange now and show you my hand of cards. So Carlsen naturally recaptures here, like this on e4. And now, since the bishop is pinning the knight, which in turn is hitting the pawn on e4, it makes sense for black to actually pose the question to that bishop. And that's what Caruana does with h6. Because if that bishop were now to retreat, let's say to e3, then maybe under certain circumstances black could take on e4 or play knight g4 to hit that bishop. So naturally Carlsen wants to maintain the pin on the knight on f6, and he plays bishop h4. Now we see a flexible move from Caruana. Normally we are taught that we should bring our king into safety as quickly as possible, which would be a good move for black at this point in time, to just castle kingside. And also we're taught in the opening to preferably develop our knights before our bishops, and to develop our minor pieces before our heavy pieces. But what Caruana plays here is slightly offbeat, because he plays here queen e7. Now, since the position is semi-closed, this is not so important. Besides, or what's moreover, this move has a few points. It protects bishop d6 and therefore prepares knight b d7, which was of course not possible with the queen on d8, because if here knight b d7, then the bishop on d6 would be hanging. Okay, now you could also say, but you were mentioning something about posing the question to the bishop, so why does black not continue to chase that bishop with g5, for instance? Well, this is a forcing move, but it's also a very weakening move. Of course, white would be forced to save his bishop with bishop g3, but now the pawn grabbing knight takes e4 is not so good, because after knight b d2, which in turn is posing the question to that pesky knight, it's going to be very risky for black. I think that he's trailing in development too much. He has too many weaknesses, especially because of the g5 pawn move, and white is very active. For instance, black could try and take here on g3, winning the bishop pair, but after h takes g3, there are already threats of knight c4 and also knight g5. And white has a very serious initiative here. If instead after knight b d2, black does not exchange on d3 and does not open the h-file, but plays knight c5, then also a move like knight c4 is really seizing the initiative for white here. He is hitting the bishop on d6, which in turn is an important defender of the pawn on d5. And if the bishop moves, then white can exchange on d8. Black would lose his right to castle. White could regain the pawn on e5 and castle himself, and then with both his rooks on the central open files, d1 and e1, I think he would have a very serious advantage. So, okay, black can also not go too far. So back to the game, where after bishop h4, queen e7 was played. And now, Carlsen just simply develops with knight b d2, very healthy move. And now we also see knight b d7, which was prepared with black's earlier move. And now comes a very strange moment in the game. Carlsen now plays voluntarily, I stress, bishop g3. Now, I find this a hard move to understand. Why would you spend a tempo in the opening playing twice with the same piece, voluntarily give up the pin of knight f6, and also attack a pawn that is sufficiently protected? I really don't understand that. And after this move, I think black is okay, and maybe more than okay. I wouldn't say that he has an advantage or something, but he's definitely fine. More to my liking, at least, would be just the simple castles, bringing your king into safety, maintaining the pin on that knight on f6, and saying to black, if you want to break the pin, then go ahead, but you can only do it at the cost of weakening yourself with a move g7, g5, which leaves a very nasty hole on f5. So play could continue bishop c7, which is a flexible move, sidestepping any possible knight c4s. So this is the sort of moving the piece in the opening twice, which is better than Carlsen's move, moving it to g3 for no particular reason. But then, at least after queen e2 finishing the opening and castles, black also finishes the opening, the game would be completely balanced. But after bishop g3, we return to the game. Black is already starting to nibble on the position a little bit from a deep strategic point of view. So, we see bishop c7. As mentioned in the previous note to bishop g3, this kind of moving the piece twice is more understandable and flexible. It is prophylaxis against knight c4 and makes the bishop more mobile. It could also go to the other so-called Italian diagonal from a7 to f2. And it just removes itself from a square where it is tactically vulnerable to knight c4s and so on. So, Carlsen now does bring his king into safety with castles kingside, but as I said, I think black already has a fine game and is now starting to hunt down white's bishop pair. He now plays the very strong knight h5, which simply has become possible because this knight is no longer pinned, right? Okay, so instead of knight h5, it was possible for black to go a bit wrong here and justify the position of bishop g3. For instance, with a move like knight f8, which would free up the c8 bishop, but it would be an untimely move because after knight e5, a surprising sacrifice in the middle of the board, we can see that white can use his superior development with knight c4. Which is hitting the queen, but also the d6 checking square. And after, let's say, queen c5, knight d6 check, and king e7, white has a very nasty initiative with black's king in the middle of the board. And I think that here he has the advantage. Also, he has already two pawns for the piece, and yeah, with a king sitting in the center like that, the rook attacked on h8, I think he has very good chances of building his advantage and winning this type of position. But okay, Caruana does not fall for that. Let's return to the game where he plays knight h5, hunting down white's bishop pair. And okay, I couldn't really understand bishop g3, but what Carlsen plays now seriously makes me wonder. Is he somewhere else with his mind? I mean, in November he is supposed to play his World Championship match against Anand in Sochi, yeah? But there are rumors that maybe that's not going to happen, and his manager asked for a postponement of the match, or at least to postpone any decision as to signing the contracts for this match. So I don't know. I have the feeling that Carlsen is maybe not completely concentrated during this tournament, and he plays a move now that, to my eye, is just plain bad and unworthy of him. To be honest, maybe he seriously wanted to spice up the game because he feels compelled to win all these games against all these guys. But now he plays h3. And I really don't understand this move. I think it's just bad. This move loses time. There was no threat of a knight jumping to g4 or a bishop coming to g4, and even then you could still play h3 or just unpin the knight with, let's say, queen c2 or whatever. But more importantly, this move also voluntarily weakens the dark squares of which he was already going to lose his bishop. So this is also a pattern that I see in Magnus's games over, let's say, the last year or so. I really don't understand why he so often puts himself on the back foot and only then begins to play chess, it seems. Now, these words are maybe a little bit harsh, but for somebody of his caliber and his understanding of the game, this is really a risk that he's taken. So, of course, Caruana now takes the bishop, because otherwise the bishop will drop back to h2. But after f takes g3, something serious has happened. The dark square color complex on white's king side is really seriously weakened. First of all, this pawn was sitting here and was protecting both e3 and g3. But now these squares have actually become weak. Also, this diagonal has now opened up for black's bishop. Of course, this pawn has also become isolated. Maybe that's less relevant because for now it's difficult to attack it and it's still protected. But it's most notably this whole dark square color complex around white's king that's going to haunt him throughout the game. So, it was now sufficient for Caruana, for some advantage at least, to just finish his opening, be happy with the bishop pair that he has and play castle's kingside. But maybe then white's play on the king side may take a bit more shape. Play could continue with knight h4, for instance, queen g5, when after queen e2 it would be a bad idea, I think, to take that weak pawn on g3. Black is not really yet ready to do that, because after knight f5 white really has achieved something. He has all his pieces handy. True, he's down a pawn, but he has superior development and ability and a very nice outpost on f5. So instead of the queen e2, black would be well advised to play something like knight c5 to try and exchange the bishop on b3, which is a strong attacker. It's hitting the f7 point. But yeah, play could continue like this, for instance, when we would see a very interesting strategical battle where I think that, okay, black may have the better of it in the long run because of his bishop pair, but somehow this would still be quite alright for white. At least he got some kingside play going, which is the f-file and the f5 outpost, some of the advantages of trading on g3, recapturing with the f-pawn. So instead of that, after f takes g3, Caruana immediately plays knight c5, hunting down the other white bishop as well, an attacker of f7. So the f-file has become semi-open, but yeah, was white really thinking to achieve something over there? We don't really know what Magnus was thinking when he gave up his bishop on g3 under these circumstances with h2, h3. maybe his idea was the move that he actually played in the game, but it's speculative and it falls short, even though it looks very spectacular. He now played bishop takes f7 check. Well, it's not possible to take that bishop with the queen. Let's take a look. If queen takes f7, then knight e5 is very strong, attacking the queen. And maybe black's best is here to give up the queen for the rook on f1, because if he tries to save it with, let's say, queen e6, then this is of course a very strong and deadly check. White is just simply winning this position. There's no way to save the king in the center. On either king e7 or king d8, there follows a knight check with knight g6 or knight f7, winning the rook in the corner. And yeah, circumstances are very bad here for black. So after bishop takes f7, Caruana was forced to recapture that with the king. And now, yeah, here should come the point of white's play. Carlsen now played a discovered double check and snatched a pawn in the process. He played here knight takes e5 check, or double check. But it was not necessary to take that pawn on e5. There was also another route for that knight, and the other route was to play knight h4, because that's another way of getting to g6, where the knight really wants to go to in the end. White doesn't really need the pawn on e5, rather he needs to bring all his pieces in as quickly as possible and keep black's pieces passive. Because what is the difference between knight e5 and knight h4? Well, if we take a look at the move that was played in the game, we can see that by eliminating this pawn on e5, white is also opening up the b8 h2 diagonal for black's dark squared bishop. And it's exactly this kind of bishop that he no longer has. So by taking this pawn, he's actually activating the c7 bishop, and this is really going to be extra oil on the fire for black. So, as mentioned, I think it was a better and safer way to try and pursue the attack with knight h4, keeping that pawn on e5. Now the game could continue as follows: king g8 and then knight g6. And then if black would try the move that he played in the game as well with bishop g5, then it makes less sense, because there is no cooperation yet between the bishop on c7 and the queen on g5, or soon on g3, because of that blocking pawn on e5. So then play could continue with rook f8, king h7, only move, takes the rook, and then takes the knight. But now there is a funny line with queen f1, when after queen takes d2, black can actually eliminate the defender of the f5 mating square with rook takes c8. Now obviously if black takes that rook, then queen f5 is mate all of a sudden. So black is forced to go for some sort of a perpetual here with queen e3, king h2 and knight e4, trying to hammer down on these weakened dark squares anyway. And now rook takes a8 would even lose, because black would break through on g3 with these moves. Check to the king, you have to go to g1, and now after knight takes h3, king h1, the bishop will have its final say, because black is open black is able to open that diagonal by eliminating the e4 pawn. So this is a winning position for black. So white is well advised not to take that rook in the corner, but instead eliminate that possibly dangerous bishop on c7, and then indeed black has nothing more than a draw after these moves. It's a repetition. Okay, and the other try after knight g6 instead of queen g5, I think was maybe queen d6, when again rook f8 would follow. But then black could sacrifice his queen, and after bishop e6 I think we have a fascinating struggle ahead, in which black's chances must be preferred. He has the pair of the bishops and a rook against the queen. Okay, white also has an extra pawn, but that pawn is not very impressive, and maybe black will have to play with his king in the center, but in the long run I really think that black's chances must be preferred here. Okay, but in the game it's all a little bit worse, because after king takes f7, Carlsen took on e5 instead of going to g6 via h4. So knight takes e5, double check was played, king g8 is really the only move, and we see knight g6. But now Caruana surges ahead with queen g5, and now this move makes more sense. If ever he gets his queen on g3, then of course queen h2 is really a deadly threat. But white still has to continue his hunt for the material here. Rook f8 check, king h7, and knight takes h8 was played. Now rook takes h8 is a little bit similar, but in the game Carlsen played knight takes h8, and this was, I think, his point. Maybe he didn't look any further than this, and he said to himself, well, I'm the exchange up, and not so sure if black is going to mate me. If he takes on g3, there is knight f3, and he's also not very well developed, and the rook on a8 is unprotected, so maybe the bishop on c8 is pinned. But I think he misjudged the position, and Caruana did a better job of it. It's true that he is the exchange up, but his coordination is bad. The rook on a1 is also in the corner, the knight on h8 is in the corner, and both rook f8 and queen d1 are also vulnerable to a black tactic, and black will play that tactic on the next move. And besides, white's king position is of course weak because of all the dark squares around it. So here came bishop g4. Caruana has to play energetically, of course, because he is some material down, so he must really go for the initiative here. Now it was very easy for white to immediately go completely wrong, with queen g4 for instance, when black would simply exchange queens, and then he would win the rook on f8, and note that white's knight remains trapped here. So as a matter of fact, black is actually going to be a piece up here, so that's a losing position. So after bishop g4, unleashing an attack on the queen on d1, but also on the unprotected rook on f8, white has only really one move to solve both problems in one go, and that was queen f1, saving his own queen from capture and protecting the rook on f8 in the process. But here came a very strong and beautiful move from Caruana, and after the game Carlsen applauded this move. He said that he had not seen it coming. Here comes knight d3 exclamation mark, and this knight is looking at the f2 square, so the threat right now is to play queen e3 and then maybe take on f8 and follow it up with a very nasty check on f2. So yeah, actually at the moment white's queen is getting a little bit overloaded. It has to protect the rook on f8, and this rook on f8 cannot save itself, because if white now would play rook takes a8, then indeed we see queen e3 check, and well, it's all over but the crying really after king h1 and queen takes g3. It's this combination of the knight on d3, the queen on g3, and especially the bishop also on c7, hammering down on white's dark squares, that decides the day in the end. Okay, so rook takes a8 really wasn't possible, and unfortunately for Carlsen he had to go queen takes d3. But of course now the point of knight d3, or the other point of knight d3, is revealed. Black now regains the exchange on f8, and the knight on h8 remains trapped. So white is a piece and a pawn up, yes, but his weak king is the critical factor here, and the knight on h8 will be captured sooner or later. So h takes g4 followed, queen takes g4, and yeah, white really has to bring in some defenders, and it was possible for him maybe to play here knight b3, with the idea of sometimes playing knight d4, from where the knight would be blocking the a7 g1 diagonal, and could also have some more aggressive intentions with such moves as knight f5, for instance, blocking the f file. And this was probably the most tenacious try. But instead of that, Carlsen played here knight f3, but this blocks the access from the queen on d3 to the pawn on g3. So I think that's why knight b3 was really preferable, because if Caruana would now take the pawn on g3 as he did in the game, then white would be able to exchange queens, and then after rook d1 hope to survive this endgame. Of course the combination of bishop and rook is better than knight and rook in most endgames, but at least he staved off any horrible mating attacks on the dark squares by simply being able to exchange the queens. But in the game Carlsen played knight f3, and now it was possible for Caruana to take on g3, but because there's no exchanging the queens here, right? Well, Carlsen probably put his hopes into his free e-pawn. He now played e5 with a discovered check, using his only trump to defend, and most notably he's now closing down the b8 h2 diagonal, and has hopes of one day, and I'm stressing one day, promoting his pawn. Okay, black's king is in check, and now it is just time to take that knight on h8, so king takes h8 was played, but immediately Carlsen surges ahead with e6, reopening the diagonal b8 to h2, and I think this is a mistake. And after this mistake his position really becomes critical. I think white should still stick to his defensive mode and not try and become too active yet, because let's not forget that there are 5 points still sitting in the corner on a1, and you cannot really expect to battle black's completely mobilized army with one of your own heavy pieces still sitting at home. So I think e6 is too active a move, and well, when you're being shaven, as they say, you should sit still. And I think it was a better try for Carlsen to play rook f1 to develop his last piece and try to bring in a defender. Play could continue now with bishop b6 check, for instance, king h1, queen g4, preparing a queen h5 check. But now there is this defensive maneuver to try and relieve the pressure. Knight h2, which prophylactically blocks the h file, but also offers a trade of the rooks. And of course, black's rook was better. So if white can exchange that rook, then why not, right? And here I'm actually, I'm not so sure if black can win this position. I guess that he is better. The knight on h2 is horrible. We have pawns on both sides of the board. The bishop is, I think, in this particular position, clearly the better minor piece, even though the queen and knight are a much famed tandem, but not under these circumstances. And white must play careful here. If he now opens up that diagonal again with e6, then the bishop returns, and white is in a bit of a predicament here. So better for him to play queen f8 check. When after king h7 he has queen d6 protecting his pawn on d5. And yeah, like I say, it's unclear if black can win this. I do think that he has the advantage, but it's also not completely clear, excuse me, how he should continue. Okay, so rook f1 on the 25th move was a better try, but instead after king takes h6 we saw e6. Well, black tries a similar attack as in the line that we just showed with rook f1, but in this case, of course, with the pawn already on e6 and the rook still on a1. Bishop b6 check, king h1, and again this queen g4 move, threatening a check on h5, or to take the pawn on e6. Well, Carlsen plays now probably the losing move. He plays here queen d6. And probably a better defensive try was, okay, then to make the best of it with his free pawn and not try to protect it, but to make black react to his direct threats with e7. And then there are some lines. I think the main line here, the best line, is probably rook e8. And then he could bring in his rook still with rook e1 to try and protect his pawn, even though black maintains a serious advantage here after queen h5 check. Knight h2 is forced really, and the bishop returns to that strong diagonal. And here there is queen h3 or there is g3 blocking the diagonal. But black is going to try and surround that pawn on h2. And it's really difficult to see how white can defend both his e-pawn and his g3 pawn. So maybe he should just move up his king, but then he will lose the bishop like so. But he's still able to kick, you know, he's a pawn down, but again, he's managed to stave off the attack. But with correct play, I suppose that with the extra pawn, black should be able to win this endgame in the end. But I still think that e7 was a better try. We just saw rook e8, which is probably the strongest reply then for black, and the other try, where he could go slightly wrong maybe even, is to first play queen h5, knight h2, rook e8, queen d7, and now this prevents the bishop from going back to c7, so that's a bit of a difference. So now black can try to use the bishop on another diagonal, bishop c5, hitting the pawn on e7, rook e1 protecting that pawn, and yeah, again, black does have the advantage, but white is kicking. So I think that also, yeah, this was a better defensive try, this immediate e6, e7. But after queen g4 in the game, Carlsen played queen d6. But now Caruana finds a very nice way to play some sort of a rook lift, to bring his rook into the game towards white's king, but with a gain of some tempi. It was possible for him to go wrong here and play the wrong rook lift with rook f5, because then e7 could make use of the weakened back rank in black's camp, and after rook h2, knight h2, there is no immediate breakthrough for black, and of course the e-pawn is on the nomination of being promoted, and the tables have turned seriously, and instead of black it is white who is winning here. But in the game, Caruana played very correct, and instead of rook f5, he found another way of activating this rook with this very strong rook d8. This hits the queen. The queen went to e5, just keeping an eye on the e6 pawn, but here comes rook d5, again harassing the queen, and now preparing such checks as rook h5, but everything with gain of tempo, right? Well, for the moment Carlsen has a counter check, and after king h7 he quickly plays e7, saving his pawn, but also threatening, of course, to queen this pawn. Now it was possible for black to go wrong again with rook h5, when after knight h2 there again is no immediate breakthrough on the h2 square, because the queen from b8 is also protecting the knight on h2. So you would somehow have to defend against the upcoming promotion of white's pass pawn. That will be possible with queen e4. And if white now does promote, then at least you can try and distract white's queen from b8, and after queen takes h2 and queen takes e8 you have, let's say, sort of defended against the promotion, but in the process white has won the exchange and also has very decent winning chances all of a sudden. But after e7, again, Caruana played very well. He did not play rook h5 question mark, but he played queen h5 check. And now, quite inexplicably, Magnus forgets about the weakness of his back rank. Of course, queen h5, which keeps black's rook on the d file still, forces white to go queen h2 here. And now, as mentioned by Fabiano Caruana after the game, his intention was to play queen e8, threatening both rook h5 but also the pawn on e7. And it seems that whatever defense white tries now, that it all falls short. There is, for instance, g4 here to try and protect against rook h5, but then queen takes e7 simply picks up that pawn, and even though white is surviving for the moment, he is probably losing in the long run. Black is a pawn up, white's king is still feeling very insecure, black's bishop is better. Yeah, but still, this was of course to be preferred over the blunder that Carlsen played in the game. And then of course there was the other defense after queen h2, queen e8, and that would be to play rook e1. But then bishop f2 could come in with tempo, and if that rook moves forward, let's say rook e1, then rook d1 simply wins material. So rook f1 is to be preferred, but then rook h5 really works, because white can no longer interpose his knight on h4, because the bishop is also controlling the h4 square, and here black is easily winning. But still, after queen h5, Carlsen had to go for queen h2 and then play this line with g4. But instead of queen h2 interposing, he played, quite inexplicably, knight h2, completely forgetting about the weakness of his own back rank. And, well, Caruana didn't hesitate. He played rook d1 check, rook d1 is all forced from here, knight f1 has to interpose, and now black is just a pawn up. The only problem that he still needs to solve is this this e-pawn, which is about to promote, but that problem is quite easily tackled. After king h2, black played queen g1, and here Carlsen resigned, because after a few checks, black will pick up the e7 pawn and be a piece and a pawn up. For instance, if king g3 or king h3, then queen e3 is a double attack on the king and also on the unprotected pawn on e7. So black would pick up that pawn and then be a piece and a pawn up, easily winning. So hence Carlsen resigned. Well, that was a bit of a shocker, and it still meant that Caruana was on a perfect score. He now has 3 out of 3 games and is leading the strongest tournament in history with 1.5 points ahead of the rest of the field. Can you imagine? So later today we have the 4th round. I'm looking forward to see all the actions. So far it's been absolutely fantastic. I think that we have somewhere around 60 or 70% decided games so far in the first 3 rounds. And we are really getting worth for our money. So kudos to the players and the team that is organizing and commenting the match. I will be following it closely. Thank you for your attention. I hope you learned something from this chess news video. Hope to see you soon in another one. Bye bye.